The crowds gathered early that morning in 1483, lining the narrow streets of London like vultures waiting for carrion. They had come to witness a spectacle of humiliation unlike anything the city had ever seen. A woman of extraordinary beauty and power, reduced to walking half-naked through the mud and filth, forced to endure the jeers and stones of the very people who had once bowed to her. Her name was Jane Shore, and she had been the most powerful woman in England, the beloved mistress of a king. But now she was about to pay the ultimate price for loving too much and trusting too little. This is the dark story of how royal favor can become royal curse, and how one woman's fall from grace became the most shocking public humiliation in medieval history. Jane Shore was born Elizabeth Lambert around 1445, the daughter of a prosperous London mercer. From childhood, she possessed a beauty that would prove to be both her greatest gift and her ultimate curse. Contemporary accounts describe her as breathtakingly lovely, with golden hair that cascaded like silk, piercing blue eyes, and a figure that made grown men weep with desire. But Jane was more than just beautiful. She was intelligent, charming, and possessed a wit that could match any courtier in the realm. When she married William Shore, a wealthy goldsmith, it seemed like a perfect match. Shore was prosperous, respectable, and could provide Jane with the comfortable life that her beauty deserved. But Jane was destined for something far grander and far more dangerous than a merchant's wife could ever imagine. The turning point came when King Edward IV first laid eyes on her. Edward was a notorious womanizer, a giant of a man who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and possessed an insatiable appetite for beautiful women. When he saw Jane Shore, he was instantly captivated. Here was a woman who combined physical perfection with intelligence and charm, everything that Edward craved but rarely found in one person. Edward's pursuit of Jane was relentless. He showered her with gifts, wrote her passionate letters, and used all the considerable power of his position to win her favor. For Jane, the attention of the king was intoxicating. Here was the most powerful man in England, offering her a life of luxury and influence beyond her wildest dreams. When Edward finally convinced her to become his mistress, Jane abandoned her merchant husband and entered a world of unimaginable splendor and equally unimaginable danger. As the king's favorite mistress, Jane Shore wielded enormous unofficial power. She lived in royal apartments, wore clothes worth fortunes, and most importantly, had the king's ear on matters of state. Ambitious courtiers and foreign ambassadors courted her favor, knowing that a word from Jane could influence royal policy. She became, in effect, one of the most powerful people in England, though her power rested entirely on the king's continued affection. But Jane's influence went beyond mere pillow talk. She was genuinely concerned with justice and mercy, often interceding with the king on behalf of those who had been wrongly accused or harshly sentenced. Many common people credited her with saving their lives or those of their loved ones. Unlike many royal mistresses who used their position for personal gain, Jane seemed to genuinely care about the welfare of others. This made her popular with the common people, but it also made her enemies among the nobles who resented her influence. Edward IV's sudden death in April 1483 changed everything. The king died unexpectedly at age 40, possibly from pneumonia, leaving behind a 12-year-old son, Edward V, as his heir. According to Edward's will, his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was to serve as protector until the young king came of age. But Richard had other plans that would destroy anyone associated with his brother's reign, including Jane Shore. Richard III was everything his brother was not: cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. Where Edward had been generous and pleasure-loving, Richard was paranoid and suspicious. He saw Jane Shore not as a grieving woman who had lost her protector, but as a dangerous enemy who knew too many royal secrets and had too much influence with the people. Most dangerously of all, she had been close to the Woodville family, the relatives of Edward's queen, whom Richard saw as his greatest threat. Richard's first move was to eliminate the young princes. Through a series of political maneuvers that culminated in declaring them illegitimate, he managed to have them imprisoned in the Tower of London, where they mysteriously disappeared. But eliminating potential rivals was only part of Richard's plan. He also needed to destroy anyone who might challenge his version of events or rally opposition against him. Jane Shore's downfall began when Richard accused her of witchcraft and conspiracy. The charges were absurd. Jane had no political power of her own and had never shown any interest in magic or sorcery. But Richard understood that logic was less important than spectacle. By destroying Jane Shore publicly and brutally, he could send a message to anyone who might oppose him. This is what happens to those who stand against the king. The specific charges against Jane were designed to be as humiliating as possible. Richard accused her of using her sexuality to bewitch his brother and corrupt the royal court. He claimed that she had used sorcery to maintain her beauty and influence, and that she had conspired with the Woodvilles to undermine his legitimate claim to the throne. Most damaging of all, he suggested that her immoral behavior had weakened Edward IV's health and contributed to his early death. Jane was arrested and brought before Richard's court for trial. The proceedings were a farce. She was not allowed to speak in her own defense. No evidence was presented beyond Richard's accusations, and the verdict was predetermined. She was found guilty of sorcery, adultery, and conspiracy against the crown. But rather than simply executing her, Richard devised a punishment that would serve as both revenge and propaganda. Jane Shore was sentenced to do public penance by walking through the streets of London, carrying a lighted candle, dressed only in her undergarments. This was supposedly a traditional punishment for sexual immorality, but it had rarely been applied to someone of Jane's former status. The sight of the former royal mistress reduced to near nakedness would demonstrate Richard's power and moral authority, while utterly destroying any remaining influence she might possess. On the appointed day, the streets of London filled with crowds eager to witness the spectacle. Jane emerged from her prison pale and thin from weeks of imprisonment, but still possessed of the beauty that had captivated a king. She wore only a simple white kirtle, a thin undergarment that left her arms and much of her body exposed to the harsh daylight and cruel stares of the mob. The procession began at the Tower of London and wound through the narrow streets toward St. Paul's Cathedral. Jane walked barefoot through the mud and filth, her golden hair hanging loose around her shoulders, carrying the required candle as a symbol of her supposed repentance. The crowd's reaction was not what Richard had expected. Instead of jeering and throwing stones, many people watched in stunned silence, horrified by the sight of a woman they had admired being subjected to such degradation. As Jane walked through Cheapside and past the homes of merchants who had known her as a girl, some witnesses later reported that she maintained her dignity despite the humiliation. She walked with her head held high, neither weeping nor cowering, but accepting her punishment with a grace that made her tormentors seem small and petty by comparison. This unexpected dignity only served to make the spectacle more powerful, but not in the way Richard had intended. The walk of penance was supposed to destroy Jane Shore's reputation forever, but it had the opposite effect. Many Londoners were disgusted by Richard's cruelty toward a woman who was guilty of nothing more than loving his brother. The sight of Jane, still beautiful despite her suffering, walking through the streets like a martyr, created sympathy rather than condemnation. Richard had intended to demonstrate his moral authority, but instead he had revealed himself as a tyrant who would torture women for political gain. After completing her walk of penance, Jane was imprisoned in Ludgate, one of London's most notorious prisons. Here she was subjected to further humiliation. She was forced to do manual labor, fed only bread and water, and denied any contact with the outside world. Richard hoped that imprisonment would break her spirit and eliminate her as a potential rallying point for his enemies. But Jane Shore's story was far from over. Her treatment had created such sympathy among the London merchants that secret efforts began to help her. Food and medicine were smuggled into the prison, and influential citizens began quietly lobbying for her release. More importantly, her persecution had become a symbol of Richard III's tyranny, adding to the growing opposition that would eventually destroy him. The irony of Jane Shore's fate was profound. By trying to humiliate and destroy her, Richard III had actually transformed her into something far more dangerous than she had ever been as Edward's mistress. He had made her a martyr. Her walk of penance became one of the most remembered events of Richard's reign, a symbol of his cruelty that was retold in chronicles, ballads, and plays for centuries to come. When Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, ending his brief and bloody reign, Jane Shore was finally released from prison. Henry VII, the new king, pardoned her and restored her property. But the years of imprisonment and humiliation had taken their toll. The woman who had once been England's most beautiful and powerful mistress was now middle-aged, broken in health, and reduced to poverty. Jane Shore lived for many more years after her release, but she never again achieved the prominence she had enjoyed as Edward's mistress. She married again, this time to a humble solicitor named Thomas Linham, and lived quietly until her death around 1527. But her legacy lived on in the collective memory of England, where her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of royal favor and the price of loving too much. The story of Jane Shore's walk of penance became one of the most famous examples of medieval public humiliation, inspiring countless works of literature, art, and drama. Shakespeare referenced her in his play about Richard III, and she became a popular subject for Victorian artists who saw in her story a perfect example of feminine virtue, triumphant over masculine tyranny. But perhaps the most important legacy of Jane Shore's ordeal was what it revealed about the nature of power in medieval England. Her rise and fall demonstrated how precarious life could be for those who depended on royal favor, and how quickly love could turn to hatred in the brutal world of medieval politics. Most of all, her dignity in the face of calculated humiliation showed that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding punishment, but from enduring it with grace. Jane Shore's walk through the streets of London lasted only a few hours, but its impact echoed through the centuries. In trying to destroy her, Richard III had instead created a legend, the story of a woman who faced the ultimate humiliation with such dignity that she turned her punishment into her triumph and her shame into her glory.